While looking for the examples of the rough and smooth bit that Xenophon advised for training, I saw examples of many early bits. 2,500 years old, and the design is so similar to our current snaffles. The full cheek looks the same as sits in any tack room. There were quite a few straight bars with decorative cheek pieces. Many museums hold examples of metal bits from very long ago, but the earliest bits would have been made of rope, wood, bone, and antler. Very little of this organic material remains from the earliest period of writing because it degrades and disappeared over the millennia. The metal bits, however, persist. It's hypothesized that some of the earliest writing that occurred, which could have been from the bowtie culture. Around 3,500, 3000 BCE, the bowtie culture in what is now northern Kazakhstan is believed to be one of the earliest groups to domesticate horses. Here is a reproduction of one of their villages where you can see that they had a corral for horses. They used horse primarily for meat and milk, but it's not much of a stretch to imagine if you captured, tamed, and milked horses that someone got up and rode them as well. There was wear patterns on the teeth of bowtie horses, very similar to those produced by metal bits, that suggests that they were using hemp rope or some similar material for control of head and jaw while riding 5,000 years ago. This would have been a bit like Louis Vallet's interpretation of an Amazon rider without a metal bit, or the more modern Native American rider in photograph with a rope bridle. The bow tie eventually died out and left no genetic trace in any human population alive today. Their horses, however, returned to the wild and are genetically linked to the Przewalski's horse. Funny little twist that the earliest domesticated horse is now the last wild horse. Around the same time period, but toward the west end of the Eurasian steppe, another horse culture existed known as the Yanmaya 330 BCE to 2600 BCE. Since metal bits didn't arrive until around 1300 BCE, I'll assume they were still using bits of wood or bone or rope as bits. They were herders of horse, sheep, and cattle moving both west and east from the central Eurasian steppe. Archaeologists feel that they have proven that the Yanmaya were riding back 5,000 years ago because their skeletons show what is known as horsemanship syndrome. They found particular biomechanical stress markers on bones of legs and hip sockets caused by sitting in the chair seat position that riding without saddles and stirrups would have caused to the rider's skeleton. The advantages of riding gradually became obvious. A mounted herder could manage 2 to 3 times more sheep than a pedestrian. For steppe societies, mounted herding made larger herds possible, with the complication that the larger herds made possible by mounted herding created the need for more pasture and had to move more frequently to new pasture. Moving more meant that the pastoralists developed residential mobility, meaning they lived moving their herds of horses, sheep, and cattle. Around 3,300 BCE, Yamnaya developed the wheel and created large wagon transport. So in essence, one could take his house and possessions while following the herds. Oxen were trained to pull the wagon, and a new way of nomadic life was developed around herding of and with horses. This residential mobility lifestyle created this expansion throughout the steppes, caused a near disappearance of settlement sites for nearly 1,000 years. It is estimated that 50% of Europeans and 30% of Asians are descended from Yamnaya as a result of their endless movement and spread. More than 1,000 years later, however, a different line of horses became domesticated in the Pontic-Caspian steppes of southern Russia. It was this line that ultimately spread across the planet, leading to every domestic horse in the world today, he says. These nomadic horsemen roamed the Eurasian steppes in bands, successors to the Yamnaya and other nomadic groups that became collectively known as the Scythians. By the Bronze Age c. 3300, 1200 BCE, we had developed metal bits, longer lasting and able to give the rider more control. At this time, as well as the early Iron Age, the use of chariots was more widespread than riding around the Mediterranean. The first metal bits were in use were bronze around 2000 to 1500 BCE. This bit is one of the earliest ever found, dating back to the 14th century BC. Horses were controlled by snaffles, jointed or non-jointed. Around the 5th and 4th centuries, BC riding became more prevalent, as opposed to driving, and the use of different bits spread. Riding in this earlier time was originated by people living on the Eurasian steppe, a vast area extending from the Hungarian plain in the west nearly to China in the east. Our early riding culture developed in several areas here, but in the Pontic steppe, an area in what is now Crimea around the Black Sea. In a site called Duravka, a 5,000-year-old burial contained a horse with wear on its teeth. Predatory nomads, notably Scythians and Sarmatians, dominated the area across the plains, and with their horsemanship skills coupled with bow, arrow, and spear. The steppe riders used mainly jointed snaffle. They spent most of their life on horseback, and I'm sure their control could be subtle, weight, and seat-based. Their pastoral herding activities out on the open plains did not require strong bits, and their warfare was based on shooting and running more than close contact sword and lance fighting, which required very immediate responses from the horses. Here are examples of Scythian bits. As fighting methods developed in Mediterranean Europe away from the hit-and-run type of warfare that was used by the steppe people to cavalry units, where fighters would interact with each other, bits could be still called snaffles, but could have rough surfaces designed to get more immediate responses. The horse was required to stop, turn, or go much more quickly to save its rider from injury. Early use of cavalry was developed by the Persian Empire in both hit-and-run archer units like the Scythians, but they also developed heavier, more hand-to-hand mounted units which used lance and javelin-type weapons. These fighters started needing more control to stop and turn rapidly than the archers. As a result, the bits started getting harsher. Snaffle bits were used for centuries by all the Middle East cultures, Assyrians, Egyptians, the Luristans, in the area where Iran is now, who favored straight bars with exquisite cheekpiece design. Here are some examples of bits from Luristan, largely bronze and from 700 to 500 BC. In 400 BC, we get an idea by the writings of Xenophon of how advanced horsemanship had become. His descriptions of training for cavalry and parade use of the horse are very similar to the methods of modern dressage. The Greek cavalry, for whom Xenophon wrote his books, fought in a harry and harass sort of way more than hand-to-hand combat, so could get by with snaffle bits, although some were spiked and therefore harsh. He also advocated training methods that made the horse more supple and responsive. At this time, riders also used cavesons, or salion in Greek, which was widely known in the ancient Near East and Greece, and is described in the Equestrian Treaty of Xenophon. There, he also indicates not to lead the horse with one rein because the bit, pulled in a wrong way, would spoil the mouth, and advises to use the caveson instead. From the time of Alexander the Great through to the Roman Empire 476 CE, nations developed more heavy cavalry units which placed advanced demand on immediate responsiveness from the horses. As a result, there was innovation and modification of the bits, and as the Romans started to dominate the Hellenic world, they adapted the curb bit, which had been developed by nomadic horsemen, the Thracian and Eastern Celts, the curb bit. The curb bit gave fighting horsemen much more control over their horses and allowed them to control the horse with one hand and use the other for weapons and fighting. This is the oldest known curb bit from around 300 BCE. As we moved away from ancient times and beyond the fall of Rome, Europeans favored heavier horses who carried armored warriors. They still required immediate responsiveness, despite the mass of heavy armor-clad horses and armor-clad men, so bits became more severe with high ports and long shanks. Here is an example from 200 BCE. I was reading a book of essays called The Culture of the Horse, edited by Karen Raber and Treva J. Tucker. One of the essays was called A Bit of Control, the historical significance of 16th and 17th century German bit books. The author, Pia F. Cuneo, describes coming across an enormous book in folio format first published in 1562, comprised of over 400 pages, illustrated with finely detailed copper engravings of bits. The lowly curb, used in 1st century BC, had become very sophisticated indeed. The author describes phenomenon of 16th and 17th century books describing the uses of and reason for using the bits shown in the engravings of the book. The engravings range from simple woodblock to elaborate productions in copper plate engravings. Some of the books would describe whether the bit was severe or not. Some would have no descriptions at all. One was full of inscriptions describing the bits that were written in Latin and German, indication of an international audience. According to Cuneo, the authors ranged from anonymous writers through local stable masters up to lower aristocracy. As time went on into the 17th century, it seemed as there was a growing sense of professionalism in the equestrian world as writers would reveal their profession, spur maker, stable master, to a member of the nobility and the like. Her title, A Bit of Control, is also her thesis, that the riders of the time really wanted some control over their horses, and I suppose unquestioned control. The books also reveal how serious the approach was to training and to what length aristocratic men would take to produce the perfect horse. During this time period, 1550 to 1650, displays of horsemanship had evolved from the battlefield and tournaments showcasing martial skills and virtues directly relevant to warfare to the manège or riding arena. In her brilliant doctoral thesis, D'Estier to Danseur, the aforementioned Treva J. Tucker describes the transition of the medieval warrior knight to the early modern courtier aristocrat identity. This shift was facilitated by managed equitation, a new form of horsemanship that allowed noblemen to demonstrate both traditional martial virtues and new but highly valued qualities, such as lightness, grace, and sprezzatura, the appearance of effortlessness. Manège equitation's intricate movements demanded a high degree of control, but the force and brutality were discouraged and considered ignoble. As we can see in the bit books, the bits still have curbs and long shanks, but grace and ease in horse and rider became important to the display of equestrian skill. Noble academies became central to this development and training of the modern horseman. The use of the curb became quite light in comparison to the emergency brake concept of earlier times. We now enter the Renaissance proper, and with it the growth of riding manuals and academies. We'll take a more in-depth look at the period and its influence on the riding of today in a little while. But first, let's look back further to the visual depictions of the horse in Paleolithic cave art.